Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to my channel where I reveal the spiritual in everything. Subscribe because I upload new content every single day and that kind of content just grows ever so much. Now you might be saying, hold on a minute David, you didn't upload anything yesterday, you didn't upload anything on Tuesday. Well no, I didn't create anything on YouTube. I was very busy the last few days, but that doesn't mean I didn't create anything. I did. I uploaded 3 installments of my commentary of the Gospel of Thomas to Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, I am here to spread the very essential message of experiential spirituality, which is nothing less than the mystic message itself. And if you want to help me do that, then you can support me on Patreon for £5 or more a month, for which you will gain access to my Patreon blog, and for which you will receive a copy of this book, Experiential Spirituality, The Mystic Answer to Everything, in PDF format, as well as my own rendition of the Gospel of Thomas. And now you will receive access to all future installments of my commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. But I have made the first 3 installments freely available to everyone. Now, why would I make the first 3 installments available to everyone? Why not just the first installment? Well, I think everyone loves a trilogy. There's something special about a trilogy to most individuals, also because saying 3 of the Gospel of Thomas is one of the best known sayings of the Gospel of Thomas. It's where Yeshua talks about how the kingdom of heaven is not out there, but rather inside of us. And he talks about coming to know God, coming to know yourself. It's a very well known saying. It's often quoted outside of the context of anything to do with Gnosticism because it's a saying that many resonate with. Now, I'll say one thing. If you go to my Patreon account, which you can do through a link in the description box below, and you go to read one of my commentaries here, again, these first 3 commentaries are free for anyone to read. I think you'll really enjoy them. When you go to read one of them, don't click here to read them, click on the title itself, because if you click on the title itself, it'll open it up, at least if you're on a desktop PC, it'll open it up into a proper format. Whereas if you click the continue reading thing, for some reason it opens up in a little side panel. It's kind of weird, it just doesn't look good. But as you can see, this is the opening sentence of the Gospel of Thomas. I said a lot about it. This is the first saying of the Gospel of Thomas. Whoever understands the meaning of these sayings will not taste death. I say an awful lot about that. I can say in all humility that you will never read a more in-depth or edifying commentary on the Gospel of Thomas than the one that I am currently writing, which is a pure matter of fact. Neither online nor in book form will you find a more in-depth commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. As I said in that first part of my commentary, there are a dozen sources where you can get historical information on the Gospel of Thomas and all kinds of theories about the history of the Gospel of Thomas, but there's very few sources where you can have someone explain the Gospel of Thomas in a spiritual way, and there's just nothing like my commentary out there. I mean, if you just read the first 3 installments of my commentary, you'll know that without doubt. You will never hear someone go into as much depth on that Gospel as I have and will continue to do so. Now, I made those 3 installments in quick succession, primarily to make up for the fact that I didn't have time for any video content on the Wednesday or the Tuesday. I don't know how frequently I'll make installments of my commentary on the Gospel, but I expect it to be more than once a week, because I've done 3 sayings of the Gospel of Thomas. There are 114 sayings in total. That means I've got 111 to go. So I don't want to do just one a week because that will take a long time. And also, my commentary on the Gospel of Thomas is not the only Patreon content I'll be producing until I finished the whole Gospel, because that would become tiresome, I think. I'm still going to mix it up. There will always be the Patreon exclusive live streams, and I'm going to continue thinking of exclusive content for Patreon, because again, I really do appreciate those of you that support me on Patreon, because you make, well, I explain to you behind the scenes everything that's going on, and you know what a difference you make to the way things are. But I'm really happy with what I've done with this Gospel so far as my commentary is concerned. And again, you're never going to find anything like it. Now, in tonight's live stream, I am going to be responding to certain questions from Curious Cat. Now, I have a lot of questions on Curious Cat just now, but as usual, I want to respond to them. I want to respond to those questions that keep to a certain theme, so that I'm not jumping all over the place to all kinds of different subjects. So the first question that I'm going to respond to is, do our ethereal forms get unmade when we reach heaven? If so, it sounds horrifying, and how would it be any different from annihilation? And as I said to my patrons in, I think it was the last live stream I did exclusively on Patreon, I'm really pleased with the kind of questions I'm getting, and I'm really pleased with them because they demonstrate that you're understanding what I'm saying, because you could never ask the kind of questions that you're asking if you were just completely lost and you didn't understand my outlook on things. So just in case anyone needs additional context for this question, do our ethereal forms get unmade when we reach heaven? If so, it sounds horrifying, and how would it be any different from annihilation? I need to give you again a brief overview of things. We are fundamentally consciousness. God is consciousness. That's how we are made in the image of God, because we are all consciousness together. And so in our expression, we have an ethereal form, which others might describe as an astral or ghostly form, which is not our highest self. Our highest self, what we are fundamentally, is consciousness, but first we emanate or we project into an astral form. We also have a mind, and we have a physical body. That, I think, is a very useful way to understand our composition as beings, as we exist in the flesh. And so what I explained was that the creation described in the book of Genesis, for example, was an ethereal creation. It was a spiritual creation. And what is described in that narrative, and I'm just using that narrative as an example here, is like the heavenly archetype of what we find on the earth. And so what this individual is asking is, if after liberation, if after salvation or enlightenment, or whatever you want to call the ultimate state that a soul can attain to, if our ethereal forms are destroyed, does that not mean essentially annihilation for us? And this is actually a hotly debated issue within Hinduism, because there are some Hindus that believe that we are to exist eternally in our ethereal forms, because that's why God created us in those ethereal forms in the first place. So if, in a certain Hindu perspective, we attain liberation, if you like, we will exist forever in heaven in our ethereal forms, just like Adam and Eve did in the narrative of the Garden of Eden. And that's the only way you can understand that narrative of the Garden of Eden, by the way. It's what it means. The tree of the good and evil represents duality, and Adam and Eve's decision to eat from that tree represents their decision to enter into duality. That is why, after that point, Adam, for example, and Eve, they were garbed in animal skins. It's why Eve endured pain during childbirth. It's why Adam was forced to work by the sweat of their brow. It's referring to the point of physical incarnation. That's what that whole narrative is about. Now, in certain Hindu ideas, we are intended to exist eternally in that heavenly state, just as Adam and Eve did after our liberation. But in other Hindu ideas, or in other Hindu perspectives, actually what happens is that even our ethereal forms are ultimately destroyed, and we get reabsorbed into Brahman. We get reabsorbed into God, ultimately. So, to use my terminology, we are fully reintegrated into consciousness. And so that's what the individual is referring to in the question. And he's saying, if our ethereal forms are ultimately destroyed, would that not be essentially annihilation for us? The answer is yes, and the answer is no. The answer is yes, in that it would mean annihilation for any sense of independence, because as long as we have a mind, we are capable of having an egoic identity, and it's only our egoic identity that gives us any sense of independence whatsoever. Without an egoic identity, we would have no sense of independence. So if our minds and our ethereal forms were destroyed and we became just pure consciousness, as God is, we would no longer have that sense of independence. Now, is that something to fear? I mean, it would be annihilation for ourselves as we currently take ourselves to be. It would be permanent annihilation for David McMurdo, for example. But then again, David McMurdo will not live beyond this mortal body anyway. That's just a fact. What we're talking about here is annihilation of any kind of egoic identity. And what would that mean? What would that be like? Well, we can't know what it would be like to be reabsorbed or reintegrated into the greater consciousness that we call God. That's an experience, that's a reality that is simply beyond our imagination. But I'll say this, is that there's much to say about deep sleep as far as spirituality is concerned. Because when you go to sleep, you know that you're going to lose yourself in that experience. You know that if you go into a deep sleep, there is nothing there. You don't exist in that deep sleep. Nothing exists in that deep sleep. David McMurdo does not exist in that deep sleep. All his relationships don't exist in that deep sleep. Nothing exists in that deep sleep. And yet, we as souls, we love the experience of sleep. And I've often talked about sleep, deep sleeps, and I emphasize deep sleep because it's possible to not be in deep sleep. It's possible to be in various different stages of sleep. It's possible to be dreaming. It's possible to be having a nightmare. I'm talking specifically about deep sleep. I've often described it as returning to the womb of God. It is, for all intents and purposes, oblivion for us. But would it be oblivion if we were reintegrated into the consciousness, having been liberated from the flesh? We can't know that. I would highly doubt that. But the point is, we don't fear going into deep sleep, even though we know that we will necessarily lose everything we think we are or everything we take ourselves to be. But we love sleep. Of course, it helps that we at least reasonably believe that we're going to wake up the next day and all of this will return to us. But we're not suffering in sleep. We're not agonizing over the loss of ourselves, the loss of our understanding of ourselves, because there's nothing, in that place there is nothing to agonize over anything. Without the egoic identity, there is nothing to suffer that kind of experience. So that's the first thing I'll say on that subject. But ultimately, we can't know what our fate is, and it's possible, and this is also a perspective held by some individuals, it's possible that that would be down to the individual soul. A soul might choose to be fully reintegrated into the greater consciousness. But the thing is, to be liberated in the first place, to be enlightened in the first place, you have to see through the illusory nature of the egoic identity. You have to let go of that egoic identity anyway. And so, would you then exist in that state of innocence like Adam and Eve did in some heavenly realm? Perhaps it is a choice of each individual soul. But I don't think there's anything to fear either way, because ultimately, when I say things like this, I don't mean them in a demeaning fashion. I don't mean them in an insulting fashion. I'm not implying anything about the questioner here. I'm just using terminology, the same terminology that I always use. The thing is, only an ego fears that kind of thing. See, when I say that, it sounds like I'm implying that the one who asked that question has a massive ego, and that's the only reason they'd ask that question. I'm not saying that. We all have egoic identities, and those egoic identities all have the same, or at least attempt to have the same influence upon us. So this is common to all of us. When we fear anything, it's only an egoic identity that can fear, or more specifically, it's only a soul invested in an egoic identity that can fear. Because the ego itself knows that it's impermanent necessarily, and therefore the ego has reason to fear. The soul that is immersed, that identifies with that ego, has reason to fear. But the soul that has let go of that ego and sees it for the illusory thing that it is, and above all else knows it as consciousness, knows itself as consciousness, knows that it has no reason for fear, because whether remaining in an ethereal form in some kind of Genesis garden, or whether being fully reintegrated into that greater whole that we call God, consciousness is consciousness, and by its very nature it is eternal. So there is no reason for fear. To quote the Apostle John again, perfect love casts out fear. So this next question, is there really no eternal punishment? If all that is and can be is God, if all that is and can be is in God, then surely the possibility to be forever separated from Him must exist. Okay, I understand this question, and I understand the error in the question, because the questioner is essentially mistaking potentiality for actuality. Because what I've said previously is that God is consciousness, and I don't want to evoke Greek philosophy and things like that, but just earlier today I was writing that third installment of the Gospel of Thomas, on my Patreon blog. And again, those first 3 installments of my commentary are free to read, and I would highly recommend doing so. But I've still got the Gnostic system on my mind, having written that installment today. So the Gnostics, being influenced by Greek mythology, sorry, not Greek mythology, but the Greek philosophers, they describe things as emanating from a central force that they usually called the monad. And so all of creation emanated from that monad. Although actually, while we might imagine this as occurring thus, so you have the monad here and creation emanates from it, actually groups like the Valentinian Gnostics, they depicted it in a different way. So what you have is a circle that you might describe as God, and the emanation takes place inside that circle, thus indicating that all of creation necessarily exists inside God, which has to be the case. As I said in that entry, that commentary on the Gospel of Thomas that I did today on saying 3, I pointed out that to say that something is outside of God is essentially an oxymoron, because by definition nothing can exist outside of God. So what I said is that consciousness necessarily, God necessarily, contains all potentiality in itself or in himself. The potential for everything. By definition, God must contain that. But the questioner is mistaking that for me saying that consciousness, God, contains everything in himself, which is not the same thing. There's a subtle difference there. There's a difference between potentiality and actuality. In other words, does God have the potentiality to emanate or to generate some kind of hellish realm that goes on forever? Yes, necessarily, because again, all potentiality must exist within God, the monad, consciousness, whatever term you'd like to use. But has he emanated that place? No. And the thing about this issue, this question of eternal damnation or a hell that goes on forever, is that you have to ask yourself, what is your basis for believing that such a thing might exist? Because whatever that basis is, I can demonstrate how it's no basis at all. See, the basis for most individuals believing in some kind of eternal damnation is either their Christian tradition or what they perceive in the teachings of Yeshua. But I could argue at length why, in both cases, those understandings are false. Yeshua never taught eternal torment, and I explain that to a fair degree in my book. It's just a misunderstanding of the way that the Greek was translated into English, especially in Bibles like the King James Bible that uses older manuscripts. We have far more manuscripts now than we did when that King James Bible translation was put together. So there is actually no basis for believing in eternal damnation anyway. But this question raises an interesting point, because, as I said, consciousness necessarily has the potentiality for anything to emerge from it. God necessarily has the potential for anything to emerge from him. He could do anything, if you want to speak in theistic terms. But we ourselves are consciousness, and that means that we as consciousness, we also have the potential to generate anything, and souls do that. That's how souls end up being lost, because they don't understand their own innate power as consciousness, and when they become identified or lost within an egoic identity, for example, they can create all manner of hells for themselves, or conversely, they can create all manner of heavens for themselves. So it's conceivable that a soul could generate its own version of eternal torment, and indeed many seem to, because if a soul is captured by this cycle of death and rebirth, and that just goes on, that itself is a form of eternal torment. So God himself has not actualized that potential. He has not actualized or created a place of eternal destruction. But we as souls, given that we are consciousness, we could effectively do that for ourselves, because we could create a situation where we are caught in a never-ending loop of death and rebirth and going to hellish realms and coming out of those hellish realms and so forth. But ultimately, we are always consciousness. It's just that we would be consciousness trapped in that loop. So it was a very interesting question, but again, there is a difference between potentiality and actuality. Just because God has the potential to manifest any reality, that doesn't mean that he has manifested any reality, including the reality that would be eternal torment. What is the kingdom of heaven, and in what sense was it coming near? Okay, this is where we have to distinguish between what the kingdom of heaven is and what that meant in the context of the teachings of Jesus, which I assume is what this individual is referring to. Okay, the kingdom of heaven is the place inside of us. It's the place we reach through consciousness. What does that mean in the context of Jesus' ministry? Well, this comes down to the difference between the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law, and the Spirit, because throughout the New Testament, especially in the letters of the Apostle Paul, the issue is the Mosaic law versus the Spirit, or specifically the understanding of the Spirit that was brought by Yeshua. And Paul is adamant that, for example, he says, those that follow the Spirit are not under the law. He says, those that, and I quoted this in my installment of my Gospel of Thomas commentary today, those that follow the Spirit, these are the sons of God. Statements like that. But as I said, Spirit is just the word the ancients used for consciousness itself. So Yeshua's teachings essentially revolved around bringing souls into a greater understanding of themselves, and the Gospel of Thomas is very keen to emphasize that fact. Again, the very saying I covered today deals with that issue specifically. Now here's a question, put aside all of my own terminology, all of that. Let's just look at it from the perspective of mainstream Christian theology for a second. So, you have the Mosaic law, and you have the unleashing of the Spirit with the coming of Jesus and, the day of Pentecost and things like that. Here's a question that will often trip a lot of Christian theologians and preachers up is, hold on a minute, what does it mean that Jesus brought the Spirit? Because it's not as if the Old Testament never mentions the Spirit. All throughout the Old Testament, the Spirit of God is doing this, the Spirit of God is doing that, the Spirit moved on this person, whether it's King David or Solomon, they are interacting with the Spirit of God in all these ways. So in what way was the Spirit that was brought about by Jesus, or through his ministry, and later through his apostles, in what way was that different from the Spirit that was active in the Old Testament? That will that question will confound a lot of Christian theologians and preachers, because they have a very specific theological framework, and the answer to that question does not fit into that framework. But the simple answer is, it was nothing to do with the fact that spirit or consciousness wasn't present in the Old Testament. Of course it was, it necessarily was. What it has to do with is the fact that for the people of Israel, Jesus was unique. They had never had a prophet like that. He was more than a prophet. He had a greater revelation of what the Spirit of God meant than anyone that had come before. And if you look in the Gospel of John, for example, he calls himself greater than Moses. He calls himself greater than the individual greater than Abraham, he even calls himself. So he's calling himself greater than all these individuals that came before him, these individuals that were the be-all and the end-all to the Jewish people. The point is, it's not that Jesus somehow brought consciousness or brought spirit into existence. It's that his teachings enabled his disciples and those who listened to them to enter into that experience of consciousness, to enter into that experience of spirit more profoundly than anyone had before. And that's why it was a transformational experience, and that's why there was this attempt to move the Jews and any Gentile that would listen away from following the Mosaic law or any kind of written law into following their own consciousness, or as I like to say, listening to their own conscience, because the conscience is always going to be superior to any written law, because the conscience, as I've pointed out so many times before, can act dynamically. So, the kingdom of heaven is fundamentally a state of being that you enter into by coming to understand yourself, by coming to know yourself, and therefore coming to know God. That's what the kingdom of heaven is. Its relevance in the context of the ministry of Jesus is that Jesus was the first one to bring that understanding to the Jewish people. The Jewish people knew all about the Spirit of God. Their scriptures spoke of it endlessly. Their great heroes like King David, they knew all about the Spirit of God, but Jesus was the first one to bring such a powerful revelation of the Spirit of God. That's why he was the Messiah of the Jewish people. But Christianity, and I know a lot of people are not going to like to hear this, Christianity was only intended to be a first century phenomenon. That was it. Because when it came to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the law was permanently done away with, and the teachings of Jesus had their effect in the first century. You know, the Apostle Paul, he was traveling around the Mediterranean in the first century, spreading the message of Christ, the same message that the other disciples were spreading. And at one point he says in the scriptures that the message of the gospel has been spread to all of creation. You know, you'll hear preachers in the modern day talk about how the gospel must be spread to all creation before the apocalypse comes or before the end comes. But the Apostle Paul says right there in his own letters that the gospel has been spread to every creature under creation. The thing is that a modern soul thinks about creation in a different way than someone in the ancient world would. A soul in the modern day thinks of creation, as the whole world and on any planet on which there might exist life, whereas when someone like the Apostle Paul spoke about creation, he was essentially speaking about the known world, the world that was relevant to him. He wasn't speaking about the entire planet, which he had absolutely no conception of. So the point is that the gospel fulfilled its purpose in the first century, and while we can look back and look at the teachings of Jesus and derive wisdom from them, as I consistently do, I mean, even now I'm doing that commentary on the Gospel of Thomas, Christianity was not meant to go beyond the first century, and it didn't. It functionally didn't. Why? Because while most individuals think that a church is just a building you go to every Sunday, the New Testament church was a collection of individuals that came to know the Spirit of God. The church was united by the Spirit. It wasn't about what denomination you belonged to. It was about whether or not you had fellowship with Jesus Christ in the Spirit. If you had fellowship with Jesus Christ in the Spirit in the first century, whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, you were part of the Church of Christ. Beyond that, there is no meaning to church. You know, just getting a bunch of people together and declaring yourselves a church doesn't make you a church, certainly not in the New Testament sense. And you can see very historically how there's a massive distinction between the church as Jesus and his apostles recognized it as essentially a spiritual collective, or a collective of souls that had reached a certain spiritual understanding, and the church as it became after the first century. Because then you had what we call the Proto-Orthodox Church, and from that emerged what we call the Catholic Church. And the history of the Catholic Church really does speak for itself. And I'm not one who, it's not like I'm some materialist who just likes to demonize the Catholic Church. You know, the Catholic Church has done a lot of good in its history, but you know what? So have a lot of institutions. So have a lot of secular institutions. The important question spiritually is, did they maintain successfully the essential message of Christ? And there can be no answer to that as far as I'm concerned, but no. Not only did they utterly fail to maintain the message of Christ, they corrupted and twisted it in many different ways, and I could make a 4-hour live stream on that subject alone. So the Christian church, as it's described in the New Testament, was only meant to be a first century phenomenon. Beyond that, it really has no application. So again, while we can, and I certainly do, look to the teachings of Jesus, look to the teachings of Yeshua, and derive wisdom from those teachings, especially wisdom that is not temporal, you know, wisdom that is eternal, that is going to be eternally relevant to anyone walking the spiritual path. That doesn't mean that you need to then become part of a collective that you arbitrarily call Christian, because the Christian landscape now is just a bunch of individuals who've got together, they've declared themselves to be Christian, and they will say that this other group isn't Christian because they don't agree with our theology. It's just an unspiritual mess, essentially. And that's the thing, that it's it's not frustrating because I've witnessed this for so long now, but there's just so many obvious points. I mean, Jesus said that you would know them by their fruits, which is to say that you would recognize a prophet or a false prophet based upon their fruits. And if anyone beyond the first century had taken just those words of Jesus seriously, I don't see how they could possibly belong to any collective that called itself Christian, because their fruits demonstrated that they weren't in fact conveying the true message of Jesus. Their fruits demonstrate that they had nothing to do with the Spirit of God whatsoever. It's quite astounding how individuals don't recognize that. But it's because individuals don't want to recognize that. Because individuals, especially when they're still identifying with something less than consciousness, they are very tribalistic. So they want to belong to this tribe or that tribe. They enjoy the interplay between tribes, my tribe versus your tribe. It's got everything to do with fulfilling base desires and nothing whatsoever to do with spirituality, and certainly nothing whatsoever to do with truth. Therefore, it has nothing to do with Jesus Christ whatsoever. So, there are many souls that can benefit from being part of a collective that calls itself Christian, but you're just wrong if you think that that group explicitly has anything to do with Jesus Christ. You may have something to do with Jesus Christ, and in your own personal relationship, you might personally have something to do with Jesus Christ if you call yourself a Christian. But the Christian church, as described in the New Testament, that was over and done with in the first century. It has no application beyond that. All of New Testament prophecy is already fulfilled, and that's really all there is to say on that subject. So the kingdom of heaven is a state of being that is achieved by entering into your own consciousness, by coming to know yourself, essentially. That's what it means now, and that's what it meant in the first century when Jesus had his ministry. But what's particular about that context is that whereas now we live in a global world and we can look back upon history and we can see all kinds of mystics who brought essentially the same message that Yeshua did, in that time in the first century, the only individual that the Jews and Gentiles of the Middle East essentially had to go to was Jesus, and therefore he made proclamations about how he was the only way to salvation. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and so forth. No one goes to the Father except through me. But when you pluck those out of context and you apply them to a global world, you're going to inevitably misunderstand them, because they were spoken to a particular group of people 2,000 years ago, a group of people that don't involve you. That's another thing that people have to realize and get real about, is that as much as we can, again, read these scriptures and derive wisdom from them, as I do, of course, they weren't written to us. I mean, people just got to get a grip, essentially, and just get over their delusions. Paul writes a letter to the Galatians. Is that letter to you? No, it was written to the Galatians. Did Paul write this letter to the Galatians saying to himself, well, one day this is going to be gathered up into a compilation called the Bible, and so even though I'm writing this letter to the Galatians really secretly, low-key, I'm writing it for the whole of the world for the rest of time? No. And you have no basis for believing otherwise. And I'm sorry to sound harsh, but there are some truths that are so obvious that you can't, again, it's that thing, you can't hope to approach truth when you're being dishonest, especially when you're being dishonest with yourself. The Apostle Paul, for example, was a guy writing letters to various churches, and what he wrote in those letters was relevant directly to those churches, because he was just a guy writing a letter. It would be like say you were part of a religious community, and you decide, for whatever reason, because your computer's broken, to write a letter to a certain congregation in your religious community. So you write your letter, you say what you have to say to that congregation, and then, some decades after your death, that letter is taken, put in a compilation with other letters, some of which you also wrote to other congregations, and then it's presented to the world as the way by which people should live. How would you feel about that? How absurd would that be? Well, that's exactly what people did with the letters contained within the New Testament. None of those authors had any clue that their letters would be contained in a book called the Bible, And if they had had any inclination whatsoever that their letter would be treated as part of a larger book that people were supposed to use as infallible moral guidance for the rest of time, do you not think they would have written them slightly differently? Of course they would have, but they were just human. Even according to mainstream Christian theology, they were just human beings, limited by the time and place in which they live. Christian theology does not pretend that the Apostle Paul or the Apostle John were superhumans. They don't pretend that they were divine. They were just humans, according to Christian theology, limited in the same way that we are. And that's the ironic thing, is that what I'm saying here is not even controversial according to Christian theology. It's just that they ignore the fact, or they come up with all kinds of theological contrivances for that. You know, on this subject, I was watching James White the other day. James White's this Calvinist theologian, and he was arguing against this more liberal Christian, and you know me, I care about who's speaking the truth. I don't care what side, what tribe they assign themselves. But someone like James White, the moment that someone who is considered a liberal or to the left says anything, he's instantly going to dismiss it. But this guy on the more liberal side, the more left side, pointed out something that I've pointed out a lot myself, which is that you cannot possibly know if Jesus spoke the words ascribed to him in any gospel, whether they be canonical or non-canonical, which is true. And you know what James White's response was? He said, well then, we can't know that Jesus wrote these things, so, well, I guess we can't really just take them at face value then. And he said it sarcastically, like as if the audience watching him is meant to go, yeah, that's so absurd. But hold on a minute, it's still the truth, isn't it? Yeah, that's the reality that religionists can't face. It's the reality that religionists like James White can't face. You notice, he didn't counterpoint that. He didn't say, actually, we can know that Jesus said these words because the truth is, you can't know that. And again, how are you going to, like, all these Christian religionists talking these really pious sounding speeches about how, yeah, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the personification of truth, and that's why we worship him. But they don't see that they are mired in dishonesty. They are mired in self-deceit. Right there, you're pretending that you know that Jesus spoke those words when you can't possibly know that. So right there, you're lying to yourself. Right there, if you acknowledge such a point, and you know consciously that you can't refute it, you can't demonstrate to yourself or anyone else that Jesus spoke the words ascribed to him in the Gospels, then right there you're lying to yourself. You're making a conscious choice of lying to yourself. There's a major issue here, a glaring contradiction in your worldview, and what you're essentially doing is refusing to face it, because you know that if you face it and accept it as a reality, you'll have to give up your entire theology, you'll have to give up your entire religion, because ultimately you have to acknowledge that it's based on a bloody massive assumption that you have no way to substantiate whatsoever. So what do? You do what's easiest, you continue on in the lie. But it is a lie, and it's never going to stop being a lie, and no matter how annoyed I make anyone by saying this in this live stream, not one individual is going to come along and say, actually, David, you're wrong, because here's how we know that Jesus said these words. They're not going to do that because they can't do that. The best they're ever going to do is get emotional about this subject, because they identify so strongly with these ideas that they take what I'm saying, even though it's true, to be a personal attack. But it isn't a personal attack, it's just a statement of reality. And so what individuals have a problem with is not people like me saying these things, it's with the truth itself. So just in case anyone isn't familiar with my approach to these things and is asking the rather obvious question, well, if you have that perspective, the perspective of reality, because we can't know that Jesus said these things, then why do you bother? Why do you care so much about the Bible? Why do you read sacred texts at all? Because you can't prove that the individuals in any sacred text actually said those things, or that they even lived at all in most cases. That's true. We can't demonstrate that Buddha lived. We can't demonstrate that Krishna lived. We can't demonstrate that Moses lived. And on and on. That's absolutely true. But as I keep saying, it doesn't really matter. That's the least important aspect of those sacred texts. Look, let's say we could prove that Jesus said those things, and we put those things to the test, and they prove to be useless. They prove to be disastrous for us, both practically and spiritually. Then the question of, the fact that Jesus lived becomes completely irrelevant. If, on the other hand, we take these teachings that are ascribed to Yeshua, ascribed to Jesus, and we put them to the test, in terms of his spiritual teachings, we put his spiritual recommendations into practice, and fruit comes from that, then who the hell cares whether a guy called Jesus said it 2,000 years ago or not? It doesn't matter. What matters is that the words ascribed to Jesus, the words attributed to Jesus, they are effective spiritually. They do something for our spirituality. They do something to improve our state of being. And if that's not good enough for any individual, then that's too bad, because that's the best you can do. You can't do better than that unless you've got some means of demonstrating that, one, Jesus lived, and two, he lived life exactly as the gospel accounts described him, which you don't have any means of proving unless you're keeping a massive secret from the world. Then you simply have to be content with what I'm saying, that these teachings, we vindicate those teachings by putting them to the test. That's all we can do, and that is the only value in all of these sacred texts. It's the only value they can possibly have for us, unless you happen to be a historian who is concerned with that kind of thing. So that's why, despite the fact I'm willing to be honest about the reality of these things, the historical reality, the fact that we can't know if these words were actually spoken by Jesus, by Moses, by Buddha, that's why I still nonetheless make a point of reading sacred texts. It's why I enjoy doing so much, and it's why I'll even go so far as to do commentaries on them. It's just that, if you read my commentary on the Gospel of Thomas, it's not like I'm repeatedly saying, assuming Yeshua said these words. No, because that would make my sentences very, very ponderous. It would make the installments of my commentary very, very repetitive to read. So no, I don't say that. I assume that anyone who would support me on Patreon, and who is generous enough to do so, by the way, I assume that such an individual would be familiar enough with my work as a whole to understand that I don't assume that someone called Yeshua lived and that he actually said these things. I'm just taking these words for what they're worth, regardless of whether they were spoken by Yeshua or not, because again, that knowledge is simply beyond us, and you have to be honest about that. But this is precisely why very, very few individuals walk the mystic path, because it requires that degree of ruthless honesty, and it's a kind of ruthless honesty that is not pleasing to the ego. It just isn't. I mean, do you think that on an egoic level I wouldn't love to believe that, yeah, great, yeah, Jesus lived exactly as the Gospels describe? I mean, I don't know which Gospel you're looking at, and I don't know how you'd reconcile all the contradictions between them, but let's put that aside. Yeah, Jesus lived exactly as the biblical Gospels describe. He definitely said every last word that's recorded in those Gospels. After 2,000 years, despite all the translations and issues like that, there's no deviation from those words. These are exactly the words of Jesus. Of course, on an egoic level, I would love to believe that. It would make my experience of reality so much easier in so many ways, not least because then I could join a Christian church. I could be part of some tribe or some collective, and I would enjoy that, and for the same reason that other souls enjoy that, because on that level, on that personal level, yeah, it's nice to belong to a big tribe, especially a tribe as big as Christianity. If you're going to include the three major denominations together, you've got, 2 billion people in that tribe. But it's not the truth. That's the problem. And if you're going to walk the mystic path, you have to adhere to the truth, and we just don't know the truth on these matters, unfortunately, and that's just the way that it is. So those were the only questions that I had intended to answer tonight, but I don't know. I've only been speaking for 45 minutes, so maybe I'll look at some other questions. Okay, what about this one? What is the unconscious mind? Again, I'm trying to answer those questions that are relevant, that kind of stick to a theme. What about the unconscious mind? I think I mentioned this in my book, or maybe I didn't. Maybe I left that bit out. But yeah, this is one of those areas where it just depends how you divide things up. So, I talk about how a good way to understand our composition is we are fundamentally consciousness. We have an ethereal form / astral form. We have a mind and we have a physical body. I could have expanded upon that. I could have said we have a conscious mind and an unconscious mind, or perhaps even a subconscious mind if you want to distinguish between an unconscious mind and a subconscious mind. But I just didn't see the need. Yeah, the unconscious mind is just a more subtle form of the mind that comes into play when we are not conscious, when we are asleep, for example, and from that place dreams emerge. But I never felt the need to categorize it especially or anything like that, because to me it's just a more subtle element of the mind. And so, on a related note, what's the spiritual significance of names and the imagination? Well, I can tell you what the spiritual significance of names is for me. Different spiritual traditions have assigned different significance to names. I mean, I think the most common significance that individuals ascribe to names is their meaning. So, the name David, for example, means beloved one. And so you can see some kind of meaning in that if you like. You can see some kind of purpose as to why I was called David. But I think it would be a stretch to suggest that every single human being is named appropriately according to their name, because I think you would quickly find it that is simply false. But the Gnostics, for example, they did assign a very special importance when it comes to names. Because to the Gnostics, or at least certain Gnostic groups, again, we can't speak about the Gnostics so generally, but the Valentinians, for example, they believed that at a certain point you received a certain name from God. And it's unclear what exactly they meant by this, but what it seems like, to go back to what I started talking about at the beginning of this live stream. So if you look at the initial ethereal creation, you got Adam and Eve. That was an ethereal creation. That was a heavenly creation, if you like. Now, Adam and Eve were given a name there. So what I think the Gnostics were possibly alluding to was a name that we were given when we were first created in the ethereal realm, at least to use my terminology. So even though I'm called David here in the flesh, David is just the name that my parents gave to my physical form, essentially. But from the Gnostic perspective, or at least the perspective of certain other Gnostics, or certain kinds of Gnostic, we were initially given a certain name when we were first created by God in the ethereal realms. And that is the name one would receive from God. That's the way I interpret their understanding of names. But then again, the problem with Gnosticism is that so much of what the Gnostics believed and what they wrote down, it was destroyed both by time and by the persecutions of the Catholic Church. So the problem is that a lot of what they believed has simply been lost to us. And that's why it's so hard to piece together their cosmologies. It's so hard to distinguish between one Gnostic group and another, where the lines were exactly, what perspective they had on this and that. So that's just what little I've gleaned from what the Gnostics believed concerning names. So I'll tell you what the spiritual significance of names is for me. And it's the most useful significance when it comes to names, quite frankly. Because, I try to stay away from abstract and convoluted theologies that ultimately do nothing but baffle and tire and confuse. I mentioned in the installment of my Gospel of Thomas commentary today that when I wrote the first version of this book, I was intending to express spirituality through a Gnostic perspective, essentially. And I'm just looking on my hard drive here because I think I still, or did I? Oh no, I do still have it. So, yeah. So what I was intending to do with the first version of this book was express spiritual truth through the Gnostic framework, through the framework of Gnostic theology. So this is the Gnostic version of that book. And as I explained in what I wrote today, it just became ridiculously complex. These are the chapters. As you can see, it's got 4 more chapters than the book that I actually ended up writing has. You know, just look at the chapter names. The chapter names alone are baffling and overwhelming. And so what happened was, I finished that first version of the book written from the perspective of Gnostic theology and cosmology, and I realized it was the most baffling thing I'd ever read. Even I struggled to understand it, and that was me fresh from writing it. And the problem is that the whole reason I wanted to write this book was to explain certain core concepts in as simple a way as possible. And really, it was a fool's errand to try and do that through the lens of Gnosticism, because advanced Gnosticism is one of the most baffling theologies, the most convoluted cosmologies you can possibly think of. So yeah, I wrote the book again from scratch, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the terminology I'd use and the way I'd express things to make things as simple and accessible as possible. And you know, whether I achieved that or not, well, that's up to the people who actually read the book to tell me. But yeah, I started again from scratch. So here's the significance, the spiritual significance of names for me. Names, quite simply, are that which our egoic identities are built on, because, as I've said, when we enter into human form, we are given a name, but when we are children, when we are babies, we don't recognize a name as a name. We don't recognize that it's a way to identify us as one soul amongst other souls in the world. We don't recognize that. We don't have the cognitive capacity to recognize that. As a baby and as an infant, all we recognize is that the name is a series of sounds. Over time, we come to realize that this series of sounds, or what we receive as a series of sounds, it's really a way of identifying us. And when we have the cognitive capacity, we understand that it is a name, and we understand the concept of a name. The thing is that that's really the first thing we understand, because we're called by our name so frequently. And what that means is that every piece of conditioning that we receive from that point forth, everything to do with our egoic identity, every detail of our egoic identity, it is built upon that foundation. It's built upon the foundation of the name. And therefore, to evoke the name means to evoke the entire egoic identity, and not even just your own name. If I say the name of a celebrity to you, for example, I'm not just singling out a certain soul in human form. I'm bringing to your mind everything that you associate with that celebrity. And so that's the spiritual importance of names for me. It's that to evoke the name is to evoke everything that a soul is. It's to evoke their egoic identity, everything that they believe themselves to be. And this, by the way, is the reason that it's so common in different spiritual traditions to assume a new name. The problem is that in most of these traditions, the reason for that has been completely forgotten. So, like a lot of Muslims, for example, they will take new names when they convert to Islam, but they don't really understand the significance of them doing that. To them, it's just an Islamic name. You know, they're now a Muslim, therefore they should have an Islamic name. And in all these different traditions, individuals take new names and they don't think about it beyond that. But this is the fundamental reason for taking a new name, is that all of your egoic identity has been built upon your former name. So to evoke your former name is to evoke your egoic identity. But if you have had some kind of spiritual awakening, or you're starting a clean slate in the sight of God, or whatever the situation may be, you want a new name because that new name necessarily does not have your former conditioning and your former egoic identity built up upon it. That's the reason for spiritual names, ultimately. But again, you don't want to take those names too seriously either, because all that will happen, and all that does happen in many cases, is that, okay, so you've taken a new name, a spiritual name, and I've got a spiritual name myself, but you've taken a new name, and what so often happens, because people don't understand the purpose of taking a new name like that, is that, okay, they've got rid of their old egoic identity, or at least they've got rid of the name that evokes that old egoic identity, but then they just proceed to build up yet another egoic identity atop that new name, which is unavoidable, because as long as you live in the world, you're going to have an egoic identity. It's just that they fool themselves into believing that they've made some kind of progress because this new egoic identity just happens to be more pious in flavour than the last one was. But it's still an egoic identity, and for as long as you're identifying with any form of egoic identity, which again you will always have, but as long as you're identifying as that exclusively, you have still made little to no progress, spiritually speaking. So that's the spiritual significance of names to me. As for the imagination, well, again, this kind of goes back to this question of the difference between the mind and the unconscious or subconscious mind, is that you could again add this new category of imagination, but to me it's just the mind. The imagination is just the mind's capacity to create, essentially, or to imagine, literally. I mean, that's all it is. So I don't really have much to say about that ultimately. Why hasn't God punished us already for factory farming? What innocence or righteousness stays his wrath? Well, that seems like a very specific example. You know, sometimes it's hard for me to tell when these questions are just like whether they're serious or not. Well, I don't know. Why hasn't God punished us for all kinds of things? Mainly because, short of some act of divine intervention, he doesn't really interact with the world in that way. God's justice is karmatic. That's certainly how the Apostle Paul interpreted karma. As I've said before, karma just means cause and effect, essentially. And when the Apostle Paul said in Galatians that, do not be deceived, God is not mocked, what a man sows that he will reap, that is the perfect summary of karma. And in the context, it's very, very clear that the Apostle Paul understood karma to be God's method, generally speaking, of inflicting wrath or, rewarding individuals. So cause and effect is the very means by which God inflicts punishment, as it were, and the very means by which he rewards. After all, who is responsible for cause and effect if not God himself? I'll give you a perfect example of this from our current circumstance. And what this is an example of collective karma, because once you understand that karma is just cause and effect, you can see it, you can understand it very clearly in the case of a soul's life. Unless you're going to look to something like reincarnation and you're going to involve further lives, you can understand it quite clearly that, look, if someone picks up something hot, they're going to burn themselves. That's cause and effect. That's their karma. But you can also very clearly understand the meaning of collective karma. And I don't know exactly what's going on in other countries just now, but here in this country, what's going on right now is that we are paying for, literally, we are paying for the foolishness of the last 2 years. The last 2 years when a lot of individuals, most individuals, thought it would be a fantastic idea to put the economy on hold, essentially, to crush businesses left, right and centre, and to essentially enact the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And these individuals, even though people like myself warned them from the very beginning, these individuals were just oblivious to the fact, in their childlike, naive way, they were just completely oblivious to the fact that they were going to have to reap the whirlwind for that. They were oblivious to the fact that if you put an economy on hold for 2 years, well, the money to pay for that is ultimately going to have to come from somewhere. And so right now in this country, we're experiencing all kinds of price hikes, especially in terms of energy. And of course, the government are trying to blame this on the situation between Russia and Ukraine, and specifically blame it on Vladimir Putin, even though this process was in motion long before that conflict emerged. But politicians will do what politicians will do. But the very same people who called for the lockdown, the very same people who called for the economy to essentially be put on hold for 2 years, are now complaining that prices have risen as they have, even though it's directly their fault. And so that is an example of collective karma. A nation as a whole agreed that it was a great idea to put the economy on hold, to crush businesses, big and small, and again, to enact the largest wealth transfer in the history of humanity. They agreed it was a good idea to do that, and here is the reward for that. The reward for that is years of hardship, possibly generations of hardship. That is collective karma. And the thing is that, as is obvious, collective karma, unfortunately, given its nature, is kind of like a tidal wave. Whereas individual karma can be considered just because that karma is only being enacted on the doer. I mean, karma literally means action. Collective karma, well, it kind of sweeps aside everyone in its path. After all, individuals like myself were against the lockdown from the very beginning. We were warning from the very beginning the very obvious thing that would happen, and yet individuals like myself will still have to also suffer the consequences of that now, even though we were against it. So collective karma is like a tidal wave that sweeps everything away. But that problem specifically, what it emerges from is the juvenile idea that many souls have that in this world things can be free. It's that old linguistic trick. It's such a simple trick where you call something free and therefore most individuals believe it to be free. Free healthcare, for example. Well, free healthcare obviously isn't free because nothing is free. It's being paid for somewhere. And as you all know, what free healthcare really means is that people are going to be taxed to pay for that free healthcare. So it's not fundamentally free. What it means is that it's free at the point of receiving that care, essentially. That's all it means. But we live in a juvenile world in all kinds of ways, unfortunately. In every way, things are juvenile. People don't want to face reality. They don't want to face material reality. They don't want to face spiritual reality. And that's just the way things are. But that's an example of collective karma there. And so when it comes to nations and the fate of nations, yeah, you can look at anything as collective karma. You can look back at Rome and the way it rose and the way it fell, and you can say, okay, Rome fell for this and that reason, so their fall was the direct result of their karma for doing this and that. And if you're of the mind of the Apostle Paul, of the same disposition as the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, we do know existed, and who we do know wrote at least some of his letters, if you're of the same mind as the Apostle Paul, then you will simply say, God destroyed Rome, and they destroyed Rome for this and this reason. That's what the prophets were doing in the Old Testament. That's what Jesus was doing in the New Testament. When he talked about Jerusalem being destroyed for this and that sin, for slaughtering the prophets and things like that, all he was doing was describing the karmatic reason that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed and the Jews ultimately scattered. Except in that particular instance, that was at the hands of the Romans. So yes, I'm just looking for other relevant questions here. What is the best way to overcome addiction? This is a very important question. Well, the thing is, there are different kinds of addiction. There's chemical addiction and there's psychological addiction. Psychological addiction is significantly easier to overcome than chemical addiction, just by their very nature. And some some things result in both forms of addiction, and that's a very difficult situation to get out of. But as always, the solution to these things is always the same, is that if you recognize yourself as consciousness and therefore recognize yourself as being transcendent to those lower parts of yourself, your ethereal form, where impulses are felt, your psychology, your mind, and your physical form, then it's far easier to detach from those urges in those lower areas that prompt you to fulfill an addiction. So again, experiential spirituality, which is again nothing less than the mystic message, it really does ultimately relate to everything in this life. And that's why this channel can grow so expansive, because there's really no subject that I can't talk about and bring spirituality into it, bring the mystic message into it, because really everything in life is relevant to spirituality. Everything in life is relevant to the mystic message. So even when someone asks about addiction, I can point out why experiential spirituality is helpful in overcoming addiction. I mean, on the most basic level, living in Scotland, and this is true of the United Kingdom as a whole, but it's a particular problem in Scotland, what you have essentially, and this is no exaggeration, what you have is a society full of functional alcoholics. And that's no exaggeration. I mean, from the perspective of the average British person, there is nothing wrong with drinking as much as the average British person does, but compared to other countries, we are really, really bad at drinking. And having worked with individuals who are essentially functional alcoholics, every single day they come into work, they have a hangover because they were up till like 4 o'clock the night before drinking. To them it's normal, but it's obviously not normal. It is dysfunctional. And in many cases I've noticed the reason they do that is because it's the only way they can be at peace with themselves. It's the only way they can dull the voice of their conscience that's telling them they are not living in a correct way. It's telling them that they've got to change. They don't want to hear that voice, and therefore they drink alcohol to numb that voice. In other cases, it can be far more serious. These are exceptions, of course, but it can be far more serious. It could be the result of childhood trauma that someone just can't get over at all. And so the only way they can have any semblance of peace at all is to numb themselves with either alcohol or drugs being another huge problem here in Scotland. But I have no need or desire to drink alcohol or to do drugs, precisely because I have all the peace and contentment I'll ever need through experiential spirituality. So it really is the solution to so many issues. In fact, it's actually the solution to all issues, because ultimately, as I said before, only a soul invested in an egoic identity really has any problems whatsoever. If a soul is not invested in their egoic identity, if they don't fully identify with their egoic identity, then even death itself is not a problem, because, again, only a soul invested in egoic identity fears death. A soul that is not invested in egoic identity necessarily knows itself as consciousness, and therefore necessarily knows of its innate immortality, and therefore even death itself is nothing to fear. Such a soul recognizes that this human experience is just that. It's a human experience that is very temporary, but it's not the end of the story. It's not the end of the journey. So I'm going to leave this rather, a live stream that went all over the place. I'm going to leave it there. Xenocrates, I hope you will publish the Gospel of Thomas at some point. What I am going to do once I've completed my commentary is gather that commentary together and, well, I've already got a Gospel of Thomas. I've already got my rendition of the Gospel of Thomas, which I will still say is the best rendition of the Gospel of Thomas that you can possibly get. And so what I'll do once I've written all 114 entries of this commentary on the Gospel of Thomas is that I'm going to gather all of those entries together and put them at the end of my rendition of the Gospel of Thomas in that single document. So in the end, what you will have is a book that contains not only my rendition of the Gospel of Thomas, but also my commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. But as I showed you earlier, that each of my installments is very lengthy, and so this is today's installment of the Gospel of Thomas, saying 3. And again, these first 3 installments are free for everyone to read, so you can go to my Patreon account through the link in the description box below and you can read them right now. But this is saying 3 of the Gospel of Thomas. Yeshua said, "If your leaders say to you, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will get there before you. If they say it is in the sea, then the fish will get there before you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will understand that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and you are that poverty." So what I do is I go line by line and explain what each of those lines means. And as you can see, I've got an awful lot to say about each of those lines. This is why I say you will never read a commentary on the Gospel of Thomas more in-depth and more edifying than this. But if this is just for one saying, and there's 114 sayings, then just think how long this commentary will be overall. It will be a very, very long document. But, okay, I'm going to leave this live stream here for now, and I will return tomorrow. I haven't decided whether I will make a video tomorrow or a live stream tomorrow. I may do things more organically from now on. Instead of having it set so that each, on a particular day I'll either do a video or a live stream, I think I'll just make a video or a live stream depending on what I feel like that day. But as ever, the content will always be daily at 7 o'clock as far as the video content is concerned. And even if something happens in my real life and I don't have time to make video content, as has happened over the last 2 days, I will still definitely upload something to my Patreon blog. So what I say at the beginning of my videos and live streams will always be true. There is new content every single day. So thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I will see